So it's part 3 of lesson 6. We've enabled delete functionality. We're starting to work on update functionality where we can click on a movie title. Now we're going to add the logic to our page to parse the URL, see if we have a movie ID. We want to query the database and fetch that movie. And then we want to render the individual properties into our form so that we can save changes. So I'm going to initialize. We've got 5 columns in our movies table, so I'm going to initialize variables for each of these. And now we can say if, much like on our delete page, if we have a movie ID and if it's numeric. So if we have no movie ID, or if we have one and it's not a number, we're just going to ignore it in this case, in those cases. But if we do have a valid number, we will read it from the URL using the get array. If we have a number, URL, store in a variable. So if we have a valid movie ID, we need to connect to our database and run a query to retrieve the details of this movie. So we can just use require to connect. And then we will run an Sql Select Query to fetch this movie from the database. So select star from movies. And we'll have a where clause because we don't want all the movies. We only want this one movie. So we will use the same where clause that we did in our delete page. We'll prepare our SQL command. We need to bind our parameter, right? We've got a movie ID parameter here. So we need to fill it with our movie ID variable that comes from our URL. So again, this is the exact same line of code we just wrote in our delete page. We're going to pass in an integer parameter. And execute our SQL. So this will go to the database and it will try to look up the movie with that primary key value that we can see in our address bar. Now we're going to do something a little bit different. When we've run queries before, we ran queries previously. So for example, we actually have a query down below where we used fetch all. This is where we were querying the genres table and we were getting a list. So we used fetch all to get all the records. In this query, we're not asking for a list. We only want one movie. So we can use a different form. We don't need fetch all. Fetch all is when we're retrieving potentially many records. So we will use the PDO fetch command instead of fetch all, as we are only getting one row, not many. So I'll create a movie variable. And we'll just call the fetch method. This gives us one row. So now we can populate our title, rating, release year, and genre from this movie record. So I'll set our title variable equal to the title column of our movie. And we'll do the same thing for rating, release year, and genre ID. This is just kind of repetitive code, one field at a time. We're going to take those records, that record from the database, and we will populate our local variables. And then I'll disconnect. So we're only doing all this stuff if we have a numeric movie ID in the URL. If it's not a number or it doesn't exist, we don't care about any of this code. I'm going to go back to the browser and click on one of my movies again. We shouldn't see anything yet. This is fetching the value from the movie from the database and storing them in variables, but we haven't actually put the variables into our form yet. I just want to try this out and see that I don't get an error. So I'll save what we've done so far. Go back. Not getting an error, so that's good. But our form is still blank. So the other thing we have to do here is we have to print out we've got to print each of these variables into the appropriate inputs. And then we'll have to deal with our drop-down selection, which is a little more complicated. Okay, are there any questions about what's happening in this section? So let's try first just to display the movie title. Once we can do that, displaying the rating and release year should be pretty much the same. So inside of I've got my title being populated here on line 37. On line 54 in my input, our syntax here is a bit messy, but we'll say value equals, and then inside of double quotes, we can actually put in a set of PHP tags here. And we can echo our title variable. Right? So we're populating the title from our database query on line 37, and then I'm going to try to inject the value into my text box. I've added the highlighted code on line 54. We'll try it out and see if it works. So if I refresh now, page. So now I get a title showing up. When I click on a movie, if I have a valid ID in my URL, the title is now being displayed. So whatever movie I pick, the title shows up. And this is a good one for editing because I actually got the name of this movie wrong. It's Newark, not New York. You'd think I'd know that since I watched the movie recently. We're going to do the same thing with our rating and release year. In our input boxes, again, we're going to inject the variables. So I'll open PHP tags. I'm going to echo the rating. And I'll move this to a new line. Same with my release year. So by adding these value attributes to each input, my form should be mostly populated. Okay, so now I get the title, the rating, and the year all showing up properly, which is good. It's good news. But now we got one other little complicated piece, which is the drop-down list. Right? Even when I pick a movie like The Godfather, that's a drama, or Star Wars, that's science fiction, my drop-down always just defaults to comedy because it's the first option in the list. So we're going to have to add a bit of logic in here to make sure that we pre-select the right option in the drop-down list. So this is a bit tricky, right? We're using a loop here to display the genres. But if we are editing, we need to check, as we're printing out this list, which one matches the genre of this movie so that we can pre-select it. So we need a bit of logic in our if statement. Right? We've got the genre ID in a variable here. So as we are looping through our list of genres, we've got to compare each one to this variable. Is the current genre in our loop, does it match this movie's genre? And if so, we want to select it. We want to select that option. So we're going to add a little if statement here. If and else. I'm going to take this line, the original echo command, and put that in the else. And here we're going to check if our genre ID, and we're going to use a double equal sign. If it equals our genre ID variable from above, so if current genre matches the genre of the movie we are editing, select this option. So the code is mostly the same. I can then copy and paste. We're just going to add one little thing here. If they're the same, I'm just going to add the HTML attribute of selected. So this if statement is going to select the correct option in the dropdown. So if we're editing a sci-fi movie, our dropdown will default to sci-fi. If we're editing a drama, it will default to drama. Without this logic, every time we edit a movie, it's going to show, the dropdown is going to default to comedy. Okay, and remember, we need a double equals here. We're comparing, is the current genre, does it match the genre of this movie. Let's see how this goes. So now when I pick a drama, notice the second option is defaulted. If I pick a comedy, my genre shows comedy. If I pick sci-fi, so this will pre-select the right option in our drop-down list. Okay, so our work on this page, it's mostly done now. I realized we had to do a fair bit. This page gets complicated. I can actually push up to GitHub what's here so far. Our form is going to need one more thing. It's not actually going to be visible, but it's critical. Right now, right, if I go and edit something, so this should be Newark, movie set in New Jersey, not in New York. If I go to save, if I change the title and save, I get movie saved. But notice it didn't edit anything. It's now created a new movie with a new ID. So we need one more thing in our form. We also need to include the movie ID in the form. So down at the very bottom of my form, maybe just before my button, I'm going to add a hidden input. The users don't need to see this, but our form needs to include the ID. We're not going to be able to update without it. So I'm going to give it a name of movie ID, an ID of movie ID, and again, a value where I will print out the movie ID. And I forgot, it's going to be type equals hidden. So this value, it's in the form, but the users don't see it. I'll show you what this looks like. Down. Oops. So when I go to edit, we don't see the movie ID. But if I view the source of my page, here it is. Why would this be critical? Why do we need to include the ID, the primary key field, in our form, especially if the user doesn't even see it? Who cares? Why did I add line 90 to the form? I go back and edit a different movie. Here's my hidden input. Okay, yes. Daniel, you're close. Right, as Tyler said, because if the table will treat it as a new row. If we want to edit an existing row, right, we don't want to create, if I make changes, I don't want to create a new movie. I want to change this one. So we need the ID on our save page, right? The save page needs to know, oh, there's a movie ID already. Well, don't create a new movie record, update the record with this primary key value instead. So if we don't include the primary key field, our save page, it's always going to add a new movie every time. It's never going to do an update. So the update requires the primary key so it knows which field it's updating. Thank you, Sarah and Tyler and Daniel. Good explanations. So our last thing to do now is we need to modify the code on save to check for a primary key. If we have a primary key, we're going to do an update, so a different kind of SQL command. If we have no primary key, then our existing code that inserts will execute. Okay, so this is the last thing we're going to need to do is open up your save page. Up at the top, first we need a new variable for the movie ID. Right, so we included a field in our form called movie ID. So this will be null when inserting, numeric when updating. Okay, so movie ID, it might have a value, it might not. Okay, when we're adding a new movie, we won't have a value because this value will get created by the database after the movie gets saved. So if I go and add a new movie and look at my page source, right? Our movie ID, it's empty. So sometimes there will be a value and sometimes there won't be a value. When we're editing, our primary key is in our hidden field. When we're adding, we won't have a movie ID yet. That's okay. So now this code needs to go in an if statement. So we'll say, if we have no movie ID, insert. If we already have an ID, update instead. So we can check our movie ID variable. If it has a value, we're updating. If it has no value, the movie is new. So we can say if empty, oops. So I'm going to move this insert statement in here. When our movie ID is empty, we are going to run an insert command. Otherwise, we are going to run an update command. And the syntax for update is different. When we're inserting, we list all the columns first and all the values second. When we are updating, we match each column with the value. So we're going to set the title to our title, the rating, the release year, and the genre ID. We're going to update all four of these values where so we're going to update all the fields from the form. We don't have to identify which fields were changed and which ones aren't. We'll just update them all. It's too complicated to determine, well, did this field value change? Did they change the rating? And if not, leave it as it is. Don't forget your where clause ever in your update. I did this once for a customer. they had an online bookstore that we built. And they sent me an email and said, can you please change the price on this one book? We're putting it on sale. So I opened up my SQL editor and I typed update books, set price equal to, and I was in a hurry. They sent it to me on 5 o'clock on a Friday, summer Friday afternoon. I was trying to get out of town. I ran the update and I forgot the where clause. So what do you think happened when I ran my SQL command to change the price in the books table? You got it, Shawshank. I updated every one of the 600 plus books to the sale price. And then I had to go and pay the host $75 to restore a backup, and I lost a day's worth of data. Needless to say, I didn't get out of town at 5 o'clock on the Friday. So make sure you have a where clause. Okay, so we have two different types of SQL commands depending on whether we already have an existing record or not. And the movie ID variable, that's going to tell us, is our movie a new one? No, Cushwinder doesn't have. It has backups. I mean, it has, yeah, there are backups. But to go and restore from a backup is not near, it's much more work than restoring from Git. Good question. Git, you can do a restore with just like one click. But it's a more complex process with database backup. So if we try to run the code right now, I can tell you right now, I could go and try to save this to do this right now. What will happen if I go to update a movie right now? What result will this give us? I'll try it in a minute, but any predictions? Will we get an error? Will it do an insert, or will it do a successful update if I go and try this out? What do you think will happen? I mean, it thinks it will insert, okay. Other predictions? What's your expectation? If I try an update, is it going to work? Hoping for an update, okay. Anybody think we'll get an error? Sarah will get a syntax error, okay. Okay, Hamid, why will we get an error with the where condition? You're right. It will try to run my update statement, but it's going to fail. How come? I'll do it in a minute and we'll see. Well, there is a movie ID, right? I have it in my form. So if I go to edit this movie, I have a value. So my movie ID variable should exist. And if the movie ID variable exists, it should run this statement, but this statement is still going to fail. I'll give you a hint. There's nothing wrong with the code we've written, but something is missing. I mean, it's interesting you raised that because it's actually the error you got earlier. Okay, Kushwinder, yeah, you're getting warmer. I mean, remember the long error? Thank you, Mark, right? We're going to get this error. I'm going to create it, the same error Hamid posted earlier, right? Number of variables does not match number of tokens. Because in our update statement, let's count the parameters. Start with a colon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This SQL command expects 5 parameters, right? There are 5 values prefixed with a colon here. How many parameters are we binding? As Mark's pointing out, right? There are 4 bind param statements, but our SQL command, it expects 5 parameters to be bound. So I'll try this out. I'll go and edit something. My insert should work. So if I add a new movie, you know, some movie, I can add, here's my movie, but if I go to edit, right, here's our favorite error. Number of bound variable, invalid parameter number of variables does not match number of tokens. So the tokens, that means how many parameters are in the SQL statement, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's what PDO is calling the number of tokens. But we are only binding, we're only populating 4 of them. So that's what gives us that error. Invalid number of parameters. So if we have a movie ID, we need to bind it as well. So we need an if statement here as well. So if, we can say is set. So if we have a movie ID, we need to bind that parameter as well. But this is inside of an if statement, right? These 4 parameters we are filling whether we're inserting or updating. We have these 4, title, rating, release year, genre, ID, in both SQL commands. But when we're updating, we have a 5th one. We have a movie ID. We need to bind it as a 5th parameter. So this should fix that error. We are binding a movie ID, but only when we're updating. There's no movie ID parameter for an insert. Because Elena, when we are inserting, we only have 4 parameters, right? Notice on line 55. But when we're updating, we have 5. So when we have an ID, we're updating, so we have to include it. When we're inserting, the movie ID comes later. The database assigns it. So this should fix our problem. So now if I try and resave and go back, now my movie has been updated from 2022. I could change this entirely. Let's say I want to change the title. I'm going to update all the fields, we'll say. 2021, and save. It says movie saved. And now if I refresh, you can see I changed the title, I changed the year. I can change, could try changing all the fields really. Right, maybe I want to make this an entirely different movie. So I'm going to change all the fields, even the genre. So now my movie's completely updated. Tyler, not sure I understand your question. If you could clarify, please. Okay, is set means, here's the explanation, Hamid. So your code editor, if you just mouse over it, it should give you a hint. Determines if a value is declared and not null. It's like the reverse of empty, basically. So we used empty to check. Is set is it's like not empty. Okay, so Tyler, make sure your bind param on movie ID is only if movie ID is set. okay? Because if movie ID is not set, we only want 4 bind param statements. We only run this one when we have a movie ID. The other thing I could do here, okay, Shawshank, so there seems to be an issue with I think with your database somehow, because it's probably the same error. I'll maybe just add on here as well that H1 put this in single. We'll also add a link back to our what do we say on our delete page? Back to movie list. So we will give the user a link to go back as well. It's not that helpful to just give them a message saying it worked and kind of leave them hanging. So now if I go to update, I can delete this one. So now I get back and I can see my change. Okay, so we have the workings of a kind of functioning website now, right? We can manage all of the data. We have the ability to do anything we need with the movie. We can add them, we can view them, we can edit them, and we can delete them, including our little useful confirmation. Now, obviously, we need to do more with this. Amit mentioned security, which we're going to add later on. We want to add a header and navigation bar so it's easy to move around. We'll want to add some other, registration and some other features as well. Maybe we want to be able to search or filter this list by genre. So show me only the comedies, show me only the dramas. So there's a number of other things we can do, but we have taken care of the basics with create, read, update, and delete. I'm going to push my code up to Git one more time. So that's all the changes for today. I do also want to go over lab 3. So we commit. So update is complete. Oops. I forgot -m. I will push. So everything we've done today is up on GitHub. Okay, your lab, which you have 3 weeks to do, it's lots of time. Let's have a quick look at it. Should be available. Oh, whoops. I will make it available now. And we'll have a look at the instructions. Okay, so you're going to populate a table from your database. So similar to what you would have done in lab 1 and assignment 1. I know it might seem repetitive, but that's okay. I want you to do this a lot because that's how you're going to get comfortable doing it. So you're going to build a table to display data from the database. Each row will have an edit link that goes to a form where you can save changes. There should also be a delete link with a confirmation. So you're going to run this script in your database. You're going to create a table called clubs. It's going to insert 7 English soccer, English football teams into your table. You'll build a page that shows all of the columns, and then you will enable functioning edit and delete. You're going to create a private repository on GitHub called Comp1006 Lab3. Push your files, make sure you add me, and also create a README file in there. And you will deploy your site to AWS and submit the links to your GitHub repo and the live page that shows your list of clubs. You have 3 weeks to do this. Okay, so you need to build 3 pages. A page to display the table for reading the data, a page for editing, and a page for, a form, and then the save and delete pages. Sorry, you need 4 pages. This will be good practice. This is the kind of task I might ask you to do on the midterm exam in the practical section. Okay, so doing the lab is good practice for the midterm. So it is due the night before the midterm, and our midterm will start at 8 a.m. on March the 7th. Okay, so no class next week, no class the week after.